Hello, and thank you for joining me for this webinar on Closing the Gap Action Plans in Comprehensive School Counseling Programs. I am Sarah Kirk, and I am the School Counselor Specialist for the Oklahoma State Department of Education. And I'm grateful you are here to learn more about closing the gap and making sure that our comprehensive school counseling programs serve all students. That is our goal. At the Oklahoma State Department of Education, we are the Student Support Office, and we resource our schools, families, and students, and of course, school counselors too. Today's presentation will be covering Closing the Gap Action Plan. So we are going to dive deep into what these action plans are and how we can use them in our comprehensive school counseling programs. So we'll talk about how they fit into the national model. We'll talk all about them, how to implement them. We'll look at some examples, and then we will summarize. All right, as a reminder, we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good as we think about implementing these Closing the Gap action plans. They can seem overwhelming, but I promise they aren't if we take it one step at a time and if we really take a deep breath and think about what we're doing. So much of comprehensive school counseling is things you're already doing. You just may need a little tweak here or a little tweak there, but most likely it's what you're already doing, but this helps you really make sure it's intentional, purposeful, and really what's best for our kids. All right, so let's dive in to see how this Closing the Gap action plan fits into the ASCA National Model. As we know, the national model has 4 components: define, manage, deliver, and assess. And those 4 components make up the outline of a comprehensive school counseling program that has positive student outcomes. When we use the ASCA National Model to guide the development of our comprehensive school counseling program, our decisions are data informed, all students are served, we know we're doing what's best for all kids, which again is our goal. We want to see that improve student achievement, attendance, and discipline outcomes so that we can say we are purposeful, we are needed, and we are making a positive impact on our students. So let's talk a little bit about, wouldn't go and then it went really fast. Sorry about that. All right, so let's talk about where these action plans fit into the national model. So we said there's those 4 components, and the second one is that manage component. I call this the behind the scenes work. It's the designing so that when we get ready to deliver our student services, they are well thought out and they are what our students need. So the manage allows us to really put thought into that design and implementation of a school counseling program that has positive student outcomes. When we don't manage our program well, that's when we end up with those random acts of counseling. We might be doing good stuff, we might be trying to serve our students, but it's not as intentional, it's not as purposeful, it's not as preventative as we want it to be. So our action plans fit under that manage component. Again, this just says there that that manage component allows us to really make sure we're planning activity strategies and interventions that are most needed for our students. So the behind the scenes work so that when we get ready to do the best work, the face-to-face work, we know we are doing the work that's most needed. So there again, you'll just see where today's presentation fits into this manage component. We know that there are a lot of elements of the manage component all listed here. And if you want to learn more about any of those, you can check out those webinars. But today we're going to be talking about action plans, specifically the Closing the Gap action plan. You'll see there that there are 2 listed: classroom and group and Closing the Gap. We are not going to talk about the classroom and group one today because I already did a webinar about that one, so you can check it out if you're interested. But today we're going to specifically address the Closing the Gap. But first, let's just talk about what these action plans are in general. Action plans are really just that. They're plans to help us look at what we're going to do. They're just plans of action, right? So they help us to really intentionally plan to help us make sure that our services provided to students are well thought out. So they define the scope, focus, timing, and setting of our instruction. Again, just adding that purpose behind it, that intention. They are working documents. So while we likely will work on these near the beginning of the school year, they're working documents. So we can always adjust as needed. We want to adjust as needed because we want to make sure we're continuing to look at that data and meet the needs of our students and do what our data is showing us we need to do. Like I said, there are those two different templates, the Closing the Gap and the Classroom and Group. So both of those templates are similar in some ways. They're similar in that they include the participants that will be involved in the activity, the description of the activity, the setting of the activity, the mindsets and behaviors of the activity, and the timing of the activity. So both templates, Classroom and Group and Closing the Gap, have those similarities. However, the Closing the Gap that we're talking about today also addresses the specific goal. So it's adding that goal alignment, the intended methods of assessing school success. So how to use that data to assess the Closing the Gap action plan. And then that measurable outcome data, that's that good achievement, attendance, and discipline change in student outcomes as a result of our program. If you have any questions about those data pieces, I encourage you to jump into either the ASCA National Model 4th edition book, the Making Data workbook, or I also did a webinar about data as a kind of an overview as well. Data is one of those things we can never learn enough about, right? We're always learning and growing our knowledge of how to collect and utilize data to drive our program. But that's a big part of these Closing the Gap action plans and results reports. You'll see often that the Closing the Gap is written as action plan / results report. That's because ASCA made it easy for you. They made it all in one document. So it's just one template. Today, we're going to really focus on talking about the action plan because the results report really falls into that assess component, which we'll talk about another day. But when we look at the template, you'll see that it's all in one document. All right, so let's dive deeper into that Closing the Gap action plan. So the Closing the Gap action plan template is a guide to help us as school counselors address the discrepancies that exist between student groups, specifically those discrepancies in academics, attendance, and discipline. So if you've listened to the webinar, or if you know a lot about data, you know that when we dig into data, we want to disaggregate that data to see what student groups data look like and how that compares to other student groups, right? Well, inevitably, we're going to find some discrepancies. We're going to find places where one student group data is different than another student groups. And that tells us there's a discrepancy and that we need to do one of these Closing the Gap action plans. We need to do something to fix it. What I love about the Closing the Gap action plan is that we know this as school counselors, right? We know it's our job to dive into data, find discrepancies, and work to close them. What the Closing the Gap action plan does is it gives us an outline to follow, a template to follow as we work to close this gap. It gives us some structure, which again is really what the national model does. It's not telling us that if there's a discrepancy between Hispanic students and white students in attendance, do A, B, and C. It's not doing that. It's just an outline, okay? So it's not giving us a formula. It's not saying you always use this to close this gap. It's not like that. It's not meant to be like that, because if it were like that, we would still have inequities. We have to use our knowledge as school counselors to close the gap. But the action plan gives us the outline to follow to get there. I hope that makes sense. I don't want anyone thinking that this Closing the Gap action plan is some sort of like all-in-one magic wand with a bow tied on top. That might be easier if it was, but it's not what we need as school counselors. What we need is a plan to follow to help us to close these gaps. We'll put in the evidence-based interventions, supports, curriculums, things like that to meet the individualized gap. Okay. So again, we know those discrepancies that are often referred to as gaps, discrepancies, synonyms, but they're identified through that disaggregated data. So if disaggregated is a scary big word, again, dive deeper into that data piece so that you really have a good understanding of that, because we need that in order to create these Closing the Gap action plans. But then once we have that disaggregated data, then school counselors can develop these action plans to indicate the activities and resources that are going to be leveraged to close the gaps. Again, individualized based on what the gaps and discrepancies are. So the Closing the Gap activities very frequently change from year to year because it's based on student need and it's based on that data. So we're not going to just say, okay, it's August, here comes our Closing the Gap action plan ready to go, because we need to constantly be reviewing that data and implementing a Closing the Gap action plan as a result of the data that we find, as a result of that disaggregated data. Hopefully, as we close the gap and we use these action plans, then that gap will no longer exist. That's the purpose, right? We've put enough evidence-based interventions in place so that that gap is lessening. Instead, we need to look and find other gaps that need addressing. So they definitely often change from year to year. But this template helps us design, implement, and document our plan to close the gap. Like we've already said a couple of times, but I just want to reiterate here, they are goal-driven. So usually one of our annual student outcome goals is focused on a discrepancy that's identified in the data. Okay, so I think when I talked about the annual student outcome goals in a different webinar, I think I gave this example, but I'll come back to it. When I was applying for RAMP, one of my annual student outcome goals was addressing discipline referrals of kindergarten students who had not attended pre-K. Because when we disaggregated our data, we saw that the vast majority of our kindergarten students who received a high number of discipline referrals had not attended pre-K. And in our school, pre-K was all day long. So those students really learned how to do school. So when they didn't have that, when they didn't attend pre-K, they came to kindergarten and they didn't have the same skills as their peers who had attended pre-kindergarten. So this was a gap we identified, and my Closing the Gap action plan addressed that gap. So again, it was aligned with one of the annual student outcome goals that I wrote. My annual student outcome goal was to decrease the number of kindergarten behavior referrals by the end of the year. Of course, it had to be written in SMART goal format, but it was to decrease that. But again, this Closing the Gap action plan was tied to that goal. Okay, so it's really good if you can do that. It's not always the case, especially if one of your Closing the Gap action plans is really specific. Like maybe it's you really dug deep into data and you saw a really specific need. We still want to address it, but maybe then you wouldn't have an entire annual student outcome goal to pair with it, maybe, but it's good if you can. All right, so again, that annual student outcome goal, if you can have it aligned, then it drives the Closing the Gap action plan, and it allows you to document all those activities and services that you are putting in place to attempt to close that gap. And sometimes these are achievement, opportunity, information, or attainment gaps. So keep that in mind, because often when we talk about these discrepancies or gaps, we think of one specific thing. Like maybe if you're a high school counselor, you automatically think about students who are college bound or something like that. Then you're thinking of it in a specific category. But when we see these gaps, sometimes it's achievement gaps, sometimes it's opportunity gaps, sometimes it's just information gaps. Are we making sure the same information gets to all groups of students, or also those attainment gaps? The Closing the Gap action plan includes really detailed plans on how that gap will be closed. So that includes the goal statement, like we said, the mindsets and behaviors we're going to address, the survey items for measuring the attainment. So that's that mindsets and behaviors data, and then a variety of activities and interventions, and then a data collection plan for all three types of data: the participation data, the mindsets and behavior data, and the outcome data. Again, if that sounds foreign, that's okay. Just make sure you dive deeper into learning more about data, either through one of my webinars, the ASCA National Model book. I mentioned the Making Data Workbook, which is amazing. The other great resource, if you really want to dive deeper into this data, is the ASCA U Data Specialist course. Right, so then the template of the Closing the Gap action plan template specifies the selection of 1 to 3 mindsets and behaviors. So we're going to pick which of those mindsets and behaviors are going to be used to as really the basis for the activities and strategies. So for my example about the Closing the Gap action plan to address the kindergarten students who had not attended pre-K, then I would have selected mindsets and behaviors that went with that. Okay, so we want them to be aligned, of course. We already talked about making sure we have that data collection plan of each of the 3 types of data, as well, and then that outcome goal as well. Okay, and if, again, we're really seeing how each of these components of the national model connect, because as I talk about this, it's like, well, once you've already done the student outcome goal template, you already have that. Once you already have that, then you already have the data collection piece in place. So anyway, it all connects, and this is just one of the pieces of the big puzzle. Hopefully you're seeing how they all connect. All right, so once we have created that Closing the Gap action plan, it really helps us to create interventions, both direct and indirect student services. So I'm going to pause there, because if you already know about the classroom and group action plans, those were only direct student services. Okay. So on our classroom and group action plan, we only listed the direct student services. But in this one, because our goal is to close the gap, it's not just to provide direct student services. The classroom and group action plan's goal was to just provide direct student services. The goal of this action plan is to close the gap. So we want to include both direct and indirect student services, because sometimes those indirect student services do more to close the gap than our direct student services. Okay, so these are some examples of some things that you would include in this action plan. Student strategies about relevant lessons in a classroom setting. So if I went in my example, and gave a lesson for all kindergarten students on, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an easy one, on task behavior in class. Okay, if I did that, then that is something I would include. Or a small group. So maybe I would pull small groups of students, and we would talk about emotion management. Or sometimes I would do individual work with some of them as well. So we would include all of that if it was relevant to our Closing the Gap goal. Okay, so I'm not going to include the goal setting lesson I did for my 5th grade students. Okay, I would include that in the classroom and group action plan, different one. This one, my Closing the Gap goal, is just kindergarten students who didn't attend pre-K. So I'm only going to include the strategy and services I provide to meet this specific goal. Does that make sense? Okay. So another thing I might include, stakeholders that may provide specific training or information to teachers and parents. Okay, so let's talk about that in my example. My Closing the Gap action plan included some love and logic parent training. That was not a direct student service, but it was an indirect student service, right? That love and logic training was an evidence-based practice that the parents of these students we were targeting to close the gap could attend. Okay, they were specifically invited to this. So that was providing training. So I included that on my Closing the Gap action plan. Other things you might do, it might involve referrals. So there might be some of the students who have not attended pre-K and are now having a lot of behavior referrals in kindergarten. Some of them might need additional services, might need additional mental health services, might need additional physical health services, all sorts of things. And then also looking to systemic issues. So we want to include that in the Closing the Gap action plan. So back to my example, we went back and talked about why weren't those families enrolling their students in pre-K. It's free. It is a public school service. So what systemic issue is in place? We found several. One was that we weren't sending home the flyer about pre-K in multiple languages. That was something that was a systemic issue that was causing part of this problem, okay? Another one we found was childcare. The bus couldn't take students who were under 4, and a lot of our pre-Kers were 4, or I guess under 5. So they couldn't ride on the bus. So they didn't have childcare to get home or anything like that. So that was an issue. So we partnered with our local daycare that had a van with buckles that could transport these pre-Kers. Okay, so you're seeing how we were identifying not just how to fix the issue, how to close the gap with the current kindergarten students, but how can we dive deeper at the systemic level and figure out what was contributing to this gap that now we were trying to close. Okay, remember at the beginning, I talked about how hopefully your Closing the Gap goal changes because hopefully you put things in place that make it where the next group of kindergartners don't have this same gap because they've become back to pre-K. They've attended, right? Or another one we figured out here is that our kindergarten teachers weren't modifying the classroom for these kids who had never been in school before. So part of it was collaborating and consulting with our teachers to make sure they understood these kiddos are in school for the first time ever. What can we do to support them? Okay, so another systemic issue, but to be more preventative in the future so that hopefully this gap doesn't exist moving forward. All right. I'm going to pause right there because I've talked a lot about my example, but you may be in a high school or middle school or a rural school or suburban or urban that may have a completely different issue. So just brainstorm in your head for just a second about a gap you might already know about or you might anticipate might be there. And just start thinking about some different things you would do to address that gap. Maybe classroom lessons, small group topics, how you could involve teachers and parents in training. Maybe how you could utilize community resources. And lastly, what systemic issues are adding to or aiding in that gap? This is just a brainstorm, just to help you put this into perspective for your school. All right. So again, this Closing the Gap action plan is one single document with the results report. We'll talk more about the results report side of it when we get to the assess section of the national model. But it's just one document to help us really look at what we can do to close this gap and if it worked, all in one. So let's take a look at that template. As always, all of the templates can be found on ASCA's website. You can just go to their website and search for the templates and it will come up. So let's take a look at it. I always think it helps once we look at the document to see really just how simple this is. All right, so like we said, we hope that one of our annual student outcome goals is aligned with our Closing the Gap action plan. So you'll put the outcome goal that is aligned there. If it happens to not be, just leave that blank. Right, then we're going to use our mindsets and behaviors. Pick 1 to 3 that fit this goal. Now these mindsets and behaviors survey items, those might be the questions we might ask, like a pre and post test. I'll read you an example out of our ASCA National Model implementation guide. So for this example, it is a middle school and they found a gap that involved 8th grade students. So the survey items, their goal was addressing peer-on-peer conflict. So these 8th grade girls were in a group and the pre-tests included 4 questions. One said, I can state my opinion respectfully. Number 2, I know how to solve conflict peacefully. Number 3, I can come up with 2 solutions when conflict happens that do not add problems. And number 4, I know when to step away from the conflict. So this is probably what the school counselor gave a little pre-test to the group before they started. And then you go through the group and give it after. So there you just list those 4 questions that have something to do with the specific goal. Right now in this box, I love this interventions box because this is just where you get to write down what you're going to do. So your direct student services, so like the example I just read, of course, they'd write small group on conflict management. Maybe you're going to provide some individual support for this group, this gap, these students that have this discrepancy. Maybe you're going to do a classroom lesson. Maybe you're going to do any sort of direct student services, an assembly on positive peer relationships, anything that aligns with the goal you include here. And of course, those indirect student services would be like that parent piece, the parent education piece, parent trainings, caregiver collaboration, conferences, parent-teacher conferences. And then also not just the parents, but teachers as well. So that teacher collaboration. So if you're working with the teacher about how to respond when this peer-on-peer conflict comes up, you want to include that there. If you're making any referrals to outside agencies, if you're involving any community partners, that sort of thing, include that there. All right, so then you've got the data collection plan. So now we've got that piece to include all of our data. And again, if this is not something that you're very familiar with, that's okay. Just know that this is a piece of the action plan, a really important piece of the Closing the Gap action plan. So dive deeper into that data piece if you feel uncomfortable with this section. But we know we have those 3 types of data, that participation data, mindsets and behavior data, and outcome data. So you'll just include those results there. And then this last piece, that's if I can talk, implications. So analyze your data and how will that data inform your practice? So you can see here, remember they put the action plan and results report in place, or I'm sorry, together in one, but most of this really is the results. So essentially all we're going to do is share what the goal is, what mindsets and behaviors we're addressing, what we're doing to address those direct and indirect student services. And then the rest of this is just the results report, our data piece. Okay. So they put it all in one for us to make it super easy. But I hope that you can see how this all in one, what are we going to do? What's the problem? What are we going to do about it? And this last piece is just, how did it work? What do we think now? So going back to my example, I would really want to talk about what we're going to, that future practice, those announcements about pre-K in multiple languages, making sure we're targeting those populations that are commonly left out. We cannot just send an email about this. We cannot expect that the paper flyer gets home with everyone. How are we going to address those transient students? You know, all of those things. And the transportation piece I talked about. So this implications, if I could say that word, part is really important. I think that that's where we get that really good change, that systemic change, right? So again, you know, I mentioned this earlier, kind of joking around, but this is just a template. It's not the answer. You have the answer because you're the trained professional. But this gives us that outline, that purpose, that intention behind what we're doing. When I think about how I would have addressed that need that came up in my school without this plan, without this action plan, I would have seen that there were all these kindergarten behavior referrals. I maybe never would have figured out the disaggregated data piece of it, that most of them were from students who had not attended pre-K. I probably wouldn't have ever figured that out because I would have never disaggregated the data. And if I wouldn't have disaggregated the data, I would have just put interventions in place for all of kindergarten. So it probably would have looked like a lot of classroom lessons or a lot of assemblies or a lot of those types of preventative pieces that I thought might work, but they weren't really addressing any of the root of the problem. I wouldn't have been involving the right parents. I definitely wouldn't have gotten to any of the systemic issues. So you can see how this template, while just a template, really helps us dig deeper, strengthens our school counseling program so much. We're not just doing a random lesson about making good choices because there's a lot of behavior referrals, right? That's well-intentioned, but it's not intentional. Ooh, I like that. Well-intentioned, but not intentional. Because we're always well-intentioned most of the time as school counselors, right? We have the best of intentions, but if we're not data-driven, we're not truly intentional. All right. I hope looking at that template eases your mind a little bit. It's a pretty simple one, and it's an action plan and results report all in one. So I hope that makes this seem a little more doable. Now, while I have you on big screen, I wanted to show you a little bit of this example in this implementation guide. Again, I strongly recommend this book. I'm pretty sure this might be backwards for you. I don't know. But they have an example results report here, and you can see the school name. This was the middle school. This is the one I read some of it to you, but they've got the annual goal there. Then they picked 2 mindsets and behaviors that aligned. They did that 4-question survey, super easy. They talked about the direct and indirect student services that they would provide to address that goal. Then you can see down here, they've got the participation data, how many students participated in what, the mindsets and behaviors data, that pre and post test, then that outcome data. Okay, so let's look, let's see what the outcomes were. All right. So the baseline data, 6 girls had 2 discipline referrals during the first 6 weeks of school. 1 girl had 3 and 1 girl had 4. So there were 8 girls and they had a total of 11 referrals during the first 6 weeks of school. So that was the gap they identified. And Then they did all of these direct and indirect student services that we talked about. They did a small group, they did individual counseling, they did a class lesson on mediation, they did parent conferences and teacher collaboration. So they did all those things, and the outcome data resulted that the six of the girls who had 2 discipline referrals had 0 during the next 12 weeks. Awesome. The girl with 3 referrals had just 1 more during the next 12 weeks. And the girl with 4 had just 1 more. So the A girls had a total of 2 referrals for the next 12 weeks. So that was an 82% reduction in referrals. Pretty good outcome data, right? And this didn't say, because I don't know, this is Markham Middle School, not mine. So I don't know exactly what gap was identified, other than that these 8 girls had a high number of behavior referrals, but I don't know what else disaggregated them. Like maybe they were all the same ethnicity, maybe they were all in the same class, maybe they were all special education students. I'm not sure. This doesn't tell me because it's not mine, but you would identify that gap, right? Maybe it was just that it was a group of 8th grade girls, and they just found this group of 8th grade girls that had a large number of discipline referrals, and that's fine too. It doesn't have to be super, super specific, as long as it's addressing a need, a gap that has come up. This gap is that these students are having a large number of discipline referrals compared to their peers. Okay, all right. So then that last piece, they would look at how to inform future practice. So they might talk about what worked, what didn't, what else is in place, what supports will be ongoing for those girls. That's an important piece too. We don't want to stop providing supports and not think about how to continue that, especially if it's a group like that might need some more ongoing support. That's when we might look into like mentorship opportunities and some things like that. All right, I am going to get us back to our slideshow and we'll wrap this thing up. All right, again, that template we looked at can be found on ASCA's website. Again, I highly recommend this book. I love seeing the examples. I find it really, really helpful. So let's talk about implementation steps. So we've kind of broken the implementation into 3 parts. We want to design, document, and implement. So let's talk about what each of those pieces mean, what each of those look like. So when we design the Closing the Gap action plan, we want to identify activities that, of course, are identified in the data. We want to identify specific mindsets and behaviors that we are addressing, and then those activities and interventions that will help us to meet that goal. So we are designing the plan, essentially. Then we're going to document what we've done. So making sure we're documenting those activities and interventions and the competencies addressed, the curriculum used, the timelines, those students, all of that into that template. And then we want to implement. So we want to make sure we're implementing those direct and indirect student services for those identified students. I already looked at an example in here, so hopefully that was helpful. Again, check out that book for more information. So let's talk about the summary. We just like when we were talking about, well, any step of this, right? Any step of comprehensive school counseling, we're seeing the connection. We're seeing how each of these parts go together. So again, not letting perfect be the enemy of good, because we don't want it to seem overwhelming and quit. But I hope that instead of seeming overwhelming, you're saying, oh, wait, I already do data. I already have goals. I already have a calendar. Well, look, you've almost got the whole Closing the Gap plan, right? So these things really, really connect so nicely, and I hope you're seeing that. Our Closing the Gap action plans are a really important piece of the puzzle because they really target those student populations that that need it the most, right? When we start digging deep into our data, when we start disaggregating our data, we're going to see discrepancies and inequities. And I hope it fires you up. I hope it helps you see just how needed you are. Because once we know these gaps are there, then we can close them. And that is our whole role. It fires me up. I hope it does you too. Because again, if we don't dig deep, well, I guess we don't know they're there, but they are, and it is not fair for our kids. So it is our ethical obligation to dig deep, find these gaps, and close them. So we're going to complete our action plan template by being driven by data, aligning with those goals included on our calendars. And again, we are continuing to update the template throughout the year. So that example we looked at in here with the middle school girls, their discipline referrals went down a lot, 83%, I think it was, in the next 12 weeks. But what if, then the next 9 weeks, one of the girls had a couple more referrals, something happened, or maybe she had a death in the family, or a crisis happen, or a traumatic event happen, or something, then we're going to pop back in and totally be updating throughout the year, right? We're going to provide those services. We're not going to say, oh, that closing the gap template was already completed. We can't do that. Of course not. We're here to meet the needs of our kids, and we'll update the template as we go. Okay, but make sure you do. Make sure you're tracking that and continuing to track what you're doing, what's working, what's not, reflecting on those strengths and areas for growth. It's constant. It's really just, that's what we do in school counseling, right? We implement, we reflect, we implement again. It's just a constant cycle of implementing and reflecting. That's what we do. It's what's best for our kids. And like I said, the results report was included in this document. So we kind of get a double check mark there, but it's not about the check mark. It's about doing what's best for our kids. And I hope that you're seeing how this piece of comprehensive school counseling is definitely what's best for our kids. I think if we were to look at all the school counseling programs across the whole nation, this would be an area we're not always as strong in. We don't always really use that data and align our goals to make sure we're closing those gaps that exist. And to make sure, again, we don't see it as a check mark, because while we may close one gap, there's going to be another one that needs to be closed. So instead of seeing it as a check mark, I hope you see it as continuous. And really the ability, how lucky we are to continuously be able to close gaps that exist in our schools. I think we are so uniquely situated to get to do that. And I hope you see it as your mission and your vision and your ethical obligation, because it certainly is. So that's a summary. I hope that makes sense. I hope this helps bring some understanding of the Closing the Gap action plans and results reports. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can help in any way. Don't hesitate to get these books and dive deep. They are so helpful. I hope hearing it's helpful, but I know reading it, seeing it, doing it is also helpful. So dive in, reach out, keep doing good work, keep learning, keep growing, and I'll see you again soon. As always, thank you for the work that you do to serve all students, every single one of them. I'll see you soon. Bye.